Imagine this for a second. You're a human baby. You can't walk, you can't talk, you can't feed yourself, you can't even keep your own body warm. You have no clue what a predator is. But every predator out there instantly knows exactly what you are. You weigh only around 3 kilograms. In other words, you're incredibly fragile, almost like a biological survival challenge waiting to happen. And yet, somehow, you're here today. That means thousands upon thousands of generations before you managed to keep babies just as helpless alive. Somewhere along the line, your ancestors figured out how to protect something so unbelievably vulnerable, not for a single day or even a few weeks, but long enough for those children to grow up, have families of their own, and repeat that process for nearly 300,000 years. So this question isn't just fascinating, it's personal. Because if even one of your direct ancestors had failed to keep their child alive at any point in that enormous chain, you wouldn't be sitting here watching this video. You simply wouldn't exist. That's a pretty unsettling thought when you stop and think about it. But here's where things get really interesting. The answer to how ancient humans kept children alive isn't just a collection of old survival tricks. It actually gives us a glimpse into one of the most advanced forms of social behavior ever to evolve on Earth, behavior that most people rarely think about. And in many ways, behavior that modern society has quietly drifted away from, possibly paying the price without even realizing it. So let's begin with the obvious question that almost nobody asks. Why is human childbirth so incredibly difficult in the first place? Most animals arrive ready to move. A baby giraffe falls almost 2 meters to the ground, lands, stands up, and is walking around within about an hour. A newborn horse is on its feet in less than 2 hours. Even our closest relatives, chimpanzees, can cling to their mothers almost immediately after they're born. Human babies? Not even close. A human newborn is completely helpless for months, relying on other people for absolutely everything. And surprisingly, this isn't an accident or some flaw in nature. It's actually the result of a very specific evolutionary compromise. Scientists call it secondary altriciality. It may sound like one of those complicated scientific terms, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. Human babies are born much earlier in their development than almost any other primate. Why? Because of our brains. Here's the challenge. Human brains are enormous, not just compared to other animals, but even compared to what our own bodies should theoretically be able to support. If a baby's brain were fully developed before birth, its skull would be so large that it simply couldn't fit through the birth canal. So evolution came up with a surprisingly clever and slightly terrifying solution. It made humans give birth earlier. In a way, human babies are born prematurely by design. At birth, a human brain is only about 25% of its adult size. By comparison, a chimpanzee's brain is already around 45% developed at birth. That means much of the brain growth that happens before birth in many other animals takes place after birth in humans, stretching over several years. And all of that development happens outside the safety of the womb, where a baby is completely dependent on other people for survival. Scientists often refer to this as the obstetric dilemma, and it highlights something incredibly important. A human infant simply cannot survive alone, not realistically, not even for a few hours. Our species literally depends on social support in order to reproduce successfully. And that changes everything. Because once you understand that, you realize this isn't really a story about individual survival skills. It's a story about teamwork, social organization, and the way early human communities were built. And what our ancestors came up with was honestly remarkable. You've probably heard the saying, "It takes a village to raise a child." These days, it sounds like a cliché. People say it at baby showers or print it on inspirational posters. But during early human evolution, it wasn't just a nice expression. It was a literal biological survival strategy. In fact, many anthropologists believe it may have been one of the biggest reasons Homo sapiens ultimately outlasted every other human species on the planet. The concept is called cooperative breeding, and it works something like this. Unlike most other primates, where raising a baby is almost entirely the mother's responsibility, humans took a very different path. Fathers might help from time to time in many species, but the biggest share of the work usually falls on one individual. That naturally limits how many children a mother can realistically raise because there's only so much care one person can provide to multiple dependent offspring at the same time. Humans completely changed that pattern. Throughout hunter-gatherer societies, which make up the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, childcare wasn't left to just one parent. It was shared across the entire community, not as a kind gesture, and not because of social tradition, but because that's simply how the group survived and functioned. Grandmothers played an especially important role. In fact, their contribution was so significant that scientists developed an entire theory around it, known as the grandmother hypothesis. Proposed during the 1990s by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, this theory suggests that human instead of continuing to have more children, older women could devote their time, knowledge, and energy to helping their grandchildren survive. Take a moment to think about that. The theory suggests that women live for decades beyond their reproductive years because experienced grandmothers became so valuable to the survival of young children that evolution found it more beneficial for them to help raise future generations rather than continue having babies themselves. And interestingly enough, the evidence supports this idea. Research on traditional societies has shown that having a maternal grandmother nearby can dramatically improve a child's chances of survival. In several populations, it's actually one of the strongest predictors of whether a child lives beyond the age of 2. And it wasn't only grandmothers making a difference. Aunts, uncles, older brothers and sisters, and even unrelated adults within the community all helped care for children in ways that are extremely uncommon among most other primates. Young children were regularly passed from one caregiver to another. They were carried, fed, comforted, protected, and watched over by several different adults throughout the day. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer communities, which offer us one of the closest living comparisons to our ancient ancestors, have found something remarkable. Among the Aka people of Central Africa, fathers remain within arm's reach of their infants for roughly 47% of the time. 47%. That's actually more hands-on involvement than many fathers in today's industrialized societies. The bigger picture is this. The social network surrounding ancient human children was incredibly strong. A child wasn't relying on just 2 parents. They were supported by an entire web of relationships. This wasn't simply a cultural belief. It was a carefully evolved survival strategy. Now let's move on to something that often surprises modern audiences. When it comes to breastfeeding, ancient human societies looked nothing like what many people consider normal today. First, let's talk about how long breastfeeding lasted. In traditional societies, and even among our closest primate relatives, children were commonly breastfed for 2 to 4 years, and in some cases, even longer. Today, the World Health Organization still recommends breastfeeding until at least age 2 or beyond. That recommendation surprises plenty of people. But from an evolutionary perspective, weaning before the age of 2 would actually have been quite unusual and could even have increased risks for the child. Now let's look at how often babies were fed. Hunter-gatherer mothers typically breastfed their infants many times every hour during the day. Some researchers estimate that during the earliest months, babies nursed as many as 4 times per hour. That constant feeding served several important purposes. It provided steady nutrition. It helped regulate the baby's stress response. And perhaps most importantly, it acted as a natural form of birth, spacing by suppressing ovulation, often delaying the next pregnancy for around 3 to 4 years. That spacing between births was incredibly important. One of the most consistent findings across studies of hunter-gatherer populations is that children were naturally spaced about 3 to Children in hunter-gatherer societies were naturally spaced about 3 to 4 years apart. That wasn't random, it was the natural biological rhythm of a species where carrying, nursing, and raising one child to a reasonable level of independence before having another was essential for survival. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating. The practice of wet nursing, where a woman breastfeeds someone else's child, appears to be incredibly ancient and has been found across many different cultures. Anthropological evidence suggests that in numerous early societies, several women within the same community would breastfeed children who weren't biologically their own. This didn't just help orphan babies or children whose mothers were sick. It also created stronger social connections between families, relationships that likely offered even greater survival advantages for the entire group. In the most literal sense, breast milk became a shared community resource. Now, picture this for a moment. You're a hunter-gatherer mother living during the Pleistocene. Every day you have to gather food, often walking several kilometers across rough and uneven terrain. At the same time, you also have to keep a completely helpless infant alive. So how do you manage that? Putting the baby down isn't really an option. Predators are everywhere. Countless other dangers exist as well. A newborn can't regulate its own body temperature, meaning even getting slightly too cold could become life-threatening in a surprisingly short amount of time. And if that baby starts crying while left alone, it's essentially broadcasting its location to anything nearby that's looking for its next meal. The solution our ancestors developed was remarkably simple, incredibly effective. And today, it's backed by a large amount of scientific research. They kept their babies in constant physical contact, carrying infants directly against the body. What we now call baby-wearing appears to have been the normal way humans raised children throughout most of our evolutionary history. The evidence comes from several different directions. From a physiological perspective, human newborns are born with a remarkably strong, grasping reflex. Scientists believe this reflex is actually an ancient evolutionary leftover that originally helped infants cling securely to their caregivers. Neurologically, the human infant brain is also built around close physical contact. Research has shown that skin-to-skin contact helps regulate a baby's heart rate, breathing, body temperature, and even stress hormone levels. Babies who are carried for much of the day also tend to cry far less, not because they've been spoiled, because that constant contact satisfies a genuine biological need. Cross-cultural studies have consistently found that in societies where infants spend most of the day being carried, overall crying levels are dramatically lower than in societies where babies spend long periods alone. Some estimates suggest crying is reduced by around 50%. In other words, excessive crying isn't simply part of a baby's personality. From an evolutionary point of view, it's often a response to conditions that signal potential danger. Ancient human babies were almost certainly carried for most of their waking hours. They slept while in physical contact with caregivers, and they were rarely, if ever, left completely alone. Modern parenting advice, on the other hand, has often moved in the opposite direction over the past century. Cribs, separate bedrooms, strict feeding schedules, sleep training. Many of these approaches work perfectly well for modern families. But it's worth remembering that, historically speaking, we're conducting a fairly large and not especially well-controlled experiment with a species whose instincts were shaped under very different conditions. Eventually, though, every baby reaches the point where milk alone isn't enough. And this is where things become both surprisingly inventive and, by today's standards, a little unsettling. The first solid foods in ancient societies looked nothing like what we see today. There were no neatly packaged organic fruit pouches, no carefully measured purees, no specially designed baby cereals. Children ate whatever food the group had managed to gather, hunt, or prepare that day, softened using whatever methods were available. One of the most widespread techniques across ancient and traditional societies was pre-mastication. In simple terms, adults would chew food first and then transfer it directly into the infant's mouth. By modern hygiene standards, that probably sounds shocking. And yes, it does transfer bacteria from an adult's mouth to a baby's. But here's the surprising part. Some researchers believe that at least some of those transferred bacteria may actually provide benefits. In fact, research has suggested that infants who receive pre-masticated food may be exposed to beneficial oral bacteria from their caregivers, which may help support the development of a healthy immune system. It's also worth remembering that this isn't a uniquely human behavior. Among our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees regularly practice pre-mastication as well. In fact, scientists believe it's an incredibly ancient behavior, possibly dating back as far as the earliest members of our own genus. Pre-mastication wasn't the only way ancient infants transitioned to solid foods. Children were likely introduced to soft, nutrient-rich foods at a fairly young age. Bone marrow from cracked bones was especially valuable because it was packed with calories and easy for infants to consume. Mashed plants, eggs, and small pieces of fish or meat were also common additions. Overall, the diet of hunter-gatherer children was surprisingly diverse. What's even more interesting is that studies of ancient teeth suggest children living in hunter-gatherer societies generally enjoyed better nutrition and experienced fewer cavities than children growing up after agriculture became widespread. Once farming societies began relying heavily on starchy grains, dental health actually declined. Believe it or not, hunter-gatherer children often had healthier teeth than many children living during the Bronze Age. It turns out that eating a wide variety of foods is generally healthier than living mostly on bread. Now, here's something very few people ever hear about the ancestral human sleep environment. Nobody slept alone. We've already touched on this briefly, but it's important enough to deserve its own discussion because it's so different from what many people think of as normal today. Across every hunter-gatherer society that's been carefully observed, and throughout the overwhelming majority of traditional cultures worldwide, infants and young children slept in direct physical contact with at least one adult, not in a separate bedroom, not in their own crib, but next to, or directly against, another human being throughout the night. This practice, known as co-sleeping or bed sharing, isn't some modern parenting trend. For roughly 99% of human history, it was simply the standard way our species raised children. The concerns raised by modern Western medicine are based on very real risks, particularly accidental suffocation when infants sleep in soft bedding or with caregivers whose awareness is impaired. Those concerns are absolutely legitimate within certain modern environments, but ancestral conditions were very different. People generally slept on firm sleeping surfaces with alert caregivers and often in cooler surroundings, meaning those particular risks weren't the same. At the same time, researchers have documented several potential benefits associated with co-sleeping. Infants often maintain more stable body temperatures. Their breathing tends to be more consistent. Nighttime breastfeeding usually happens more frequently, and mothers often continue breastfeeding for longer periods overall. There's also an interesting theory involving sudden infant death syndrome, commonly known as SIDS. Anthropologist James McKenna, who has spent decades researching infant sleep, has proposed that the natural sounds, movement, and breathing of a nearby sleeping adult may help stimulate and regulate an infant's own breathing during an early stage of development when that system is still maturing. Whether that specific explanation ultimately proves completely accurate or not, the broader conclusion remains important. Human infants appear to have evolved expecting close physical contact while sleeping. The idea of a completely separate nursery is an extremely recent development in human history. And when you look at infant survival across most of our past, it certainly suggests that those older practices were serving important biological purposes. Now, let's also be honest about something else. By today's standards, infant mortality throughout most of human history was heartbreakingly high. Current estimates suggest that during the Paleolithic and early Neolithic periods, somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before reaching the age of 5. That wasn't because ancient parents didn't love or care for their children. They simply lived without germ theory, without antibiotics, without vaccines, without modern nutrition science, without nearly all of the medical advances that have helped reduce child mortality by roughly 96% since the year 1800. They did the very best they could with the knowledge available to them. And surprisingly, some of those methods genuinely worked. The use of medicinal plants stretches back remarkably far into human history. Even chimpanzees have been observed self-medicating by selecting particular plants. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence points to deliberate herbal medicine going back at least 50,000 years. Traditional societies gradually developed sophisticated collections of plant-based remedies, what scientists call pharmacopoeias, many of which continue to inspire modern pharmaceutical research today. Take willow bark, for example. Long before aspirin was created, willow bark had already been used for thousands of years to relieve pain and reduce fever. Honey served as a natural antimicrobial treatment for wounds in ancient Egypt, and almost certainly much earlier. And garlic, now known to possess genuine antimicrobial properties, was being used by ancient people long before anyone understood the science behind it. Of course, None of these remedies could cure bacterial meningitis or prevent severe dehydration, but they certainly weren't useless. Another practice found almost everywhere was ritual. Every known human culture developed ceremonies surrounding birth and early childhood. Naming ceremonies, protective charms, prayers, rites of passage. To modern eyes, many of these traditions may appear to be nothing more than superstition. But anthropologists argue they served very real social purposes. They strengthened the community's connection to the child. They made responsibility for the child's well-being a shared obligation. And they gave families meaningful ways to cope with grief during a time when the loss of children was tragically common. There is evidence. Archaeological evidence shows that the grief was real and deeply personal. Infant burials discovered at ancient sites were often arranged with great care. Some included grave goods, while others even contained flowers. These discoveries challenged the old assumption that ancient people were somehow indifferent to the deaths of their children, or that life was considered so inexpensive that loss barely mattered. The archaeological record tells a very different story. They mourned, they cared, and over thousands of years, they slowly built up practical knowledge that helped improve a child's chances of survival, one generation at a time. Now, here's the part that surprises most people. Some of the ways ancient humans cared for children were actually more effective than some of the practices that later replaced them. Not all of them. Absolutely not. Vaccine, clean drinking water, moderne medicine. These aren't controversial improvements. The dramatic decline in child mortality during the 20th century stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements without question. No reasonable person is suggesting we should return to a world where nearly 40% of children died before reaching adulthood. But when we shift the conversation from medicine to everyday childcare, the emotional, physical, and social environment surrounding young children, the picture becomes much more interesting. There's a strong argument that industrialized societies have dismantled support systems that played an important role for thousands of years, often without fully appreciating what those systems were doing. Think about the extended family. For most of human history, childcare responsibilities were shared among multiple adults. Today, especially in many Western countries, families are often limited to a small nuclear household. Many relatives live far away. Some parents raise children with almost no nearby support at all. Constant physical contact has also changed dramatically. Instead of babies spending most of the day being held, they're often placed in bouncers, swings, playpens, and other devices specifically designed to keep them occupied without needing to be carried. The communal sleeping arrangements that shaped human evolution have largely been replaced by separate nurseries, along with a cultural belief that encouraging independence from infancy is especially important. From an evolutionary perspective, that's actually a fairly unusual shift. None of this means modern parents are doing something wrong. Far from it. These changes are largely the result of broader economic and social forces. Urbanization, two-income households, the gradual disappearance of large extended family networks. Those transformations weren't driven by research into child development. They happened because society itself changed. Parents today are simply doing the best they can within those realities. Even so, rates of postpartum depression, infant sleep difficulties, and parental burnout across industrialized nations remain well documented and remarkably high. And when you compare the social environment modern parents navigate with the one humans evolved in over hundreds of thousands of years, the difference is striking. For ancient humans, the answer to the question, "How do you keep a child alive?" was surprisingly simple. You don't do it alone. In fact, you don't even rely on just two parents. You rely on the entire community. You spread out the responsibility. You share the exhaustion. You build a system where no single adult becomes the only point of failure for a child's survival. That wasn't merely a cultural tradition. It was a carefully refined survival strategy. So how exactly did ancient humans keep children alive? They carried their babies almost constantly. They breastfed for years rather than months. They slept beside their children every night. They softened food by chewing it before feeding it to infants. They surrounded every child with an entire network of caring adults, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, older siblings, neighbors, and friends, people who genuinely shared responsibility for that child's well-being. When children died, they grieved. And sadly, that happened far more often than it does today. They tried to understand illness using the limited knowledge available to them. They created rituals that helped communities stay united through unimaginable loss. Generation after generation, they passed down what they had learned through traditions, everyday practices, and eventually, much later, through written records. And running through every one of those cultures, every era, and every corner of the world is one remarkably consistent pattern. Children thrived when they were surrounded by strong social connections. They struggled when they were isolated. That isn't just a lesson from ancient history. It's a truth that still resonates today. Modern society has developed extraordinary technology to keep children physically safe. We've made incredible progress against the diseases and biological dangers that once claimed the lives of nearly half of all children before they were even old enough to attend school. That achievement is nothing short of remarkable, but the social technology, the rich, overlapping network of human care that our species spent hundreds of thousands of years developing, is the part we're still trying to protect. Ancient humans had no antibiotics, no ultrasounds, no infant formula, no pediatricians, no car seats. What they did have was each other, and for most of the challenges that truly mattered, that was enough.